Thank you, Christina. Let us pray. Our gracious, loving Father, we thank you for this time that you have given us. We ask now that you would speak through me to your people. May the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts be acceptable to you. We ask this in Jesus' name. So we have been going through the book of Hebrews for the past few weeks, and we will continue to do so till the start of Advent this year. The book of Hebrews was a controversial book, and it found acceptance into the New Testament canon quite late compared to the other books. Now, one reason is that it is anonymous. The author doesn't identify himself. And another reason is that it focuses very heavily on the rituals of the Old Testament. This second reason is why many scholars think the book was actually written to a predominantly Jewish audience, hence the name Hebrews. But humans are quite adept at learning new languages, immersing themselves in new cultures. We ourselves have a Bible that was written to ancient Hebrews, from the second millennium BC to, the middle of the first millennium BC. And also to the residents of the Roman Empire. We're talking about the New Testament now, the first century AD. But we would be wrong to think that the Bible is written to us. We have, by reading, by translating, by immersing ourselves, we are bridging that gap that is there, in order to. So the idea that just because something is focusing on Jewish law means that the audience was Jewish is just erroneous. It is my view that Hebrews was written to a mixed audience, and that the author expected his audience to be extremely knowledgeable about the Old Testament, including the various ritual practices of the Israelites and the covenants that God made with them. Now, our passage for today is a continuation from the passage dealt with last week. You know how I dislike all these chapter divisions and section headings and all of that. The chapter divisions are much later, introduction. The earliest readers of this book would have read it right through from chapter 1, verse 1 to chapter 13, verse, 25, 26, whatever it is. So we need to do that also. Chapter 4 concluded with the words, "Therefore, let us confidently approach the throne of grace to receive mercy and find grace whenever we need help." And chapter 5 then begins with the words, "For every high priest is taken from among the people and appointed to represent them before God, to offer both gifts and sacrifices for sins." So we can see, according to the flow of the argument, the reason we can approach the throne of grace is linked to the fact that the high priest is taken from among the people. Now, this is a very key idea here, that of humility. The high priest, even though he is given such a high position of authority, was one of the people. Hebrews goes to a great length to insist that the high priest was exactly like the other people, the common folk. He was subject to the same weaknesses. But precisely because he was subject to the same weaknesses, his offerings were inevitably made also for himself and not only for the people. And because of this, the role of the high priest was something that people were not aspiring to. It's a calling from God. You couldn't say, "Hey, you know what? I see myself becoming high priest one day," or something like that. It wasn't something like that. So Hebrews wants the listener to view Jesus now as a high priest who is superior to the high priest from Aaron's line. However, the author of Hebrews recognizes that there is a problem. According to the Old Testament, the priesthood of the covenant was received only by Aaron's descendants. Jesus was descended, from the tribe of Judah, and therefore he could not be a priest from the line of Aaron. What kind of a priest is he if he is a high priest then? So in answering this question, we see the great insight that the author of Hebrews was inspired to receive. It is true that Jesus is not a descendant of Aaron, but the Aaronic priesthood was not the only kind of priesthood that we see in the Old Testament. There is another, the one represented in and through the enigmatic character Melchizedek. Melchizedek is mentioned only twice in the Old Testament, once in Genesis chapter 14 when Abraham meets him, and once in Psalm 110, where his priesthood is referred to as something that is ascribed to David's law. The author of Hebrews, through the inspiration, concludes that Jesus must belong to this same priesthood as Melchizedek. The author of Hebrews expects the listeners to gain comfort from this claim that Jesus' priesthood is the same as that of Melchizedek. But it is not the kind of comfort we might expect. He says, during his earthly life, Christ offered both requests and supplications with loud cries and tears to the one who was able to save him from death, and he was heard because of his devotion. This would make the listener think, so God will hear the cheerful cries of those who are devoted to him. And the author of Hebrews would concur. God will listen to the tear-filled cries of those who are devoted to him. But the author of Hebrews would also want to correct any erroneous ideas we may have of being heard by God. Think about it. Even though Hebrews says that, he proclaimed loud cries to the one who could save him from death. When was it that Jesus most clearly cried out loud and with tears? We could think of Gethsemane, where the Gospels tell us that Jesus really cried to the Father to save him, if possible, from the ordeal that he was going to face. Or we could think of his cry of dereliction from the cross. My God, why have you forsaken me? Both of these are classic instances where Jesus cried out loud to the Father who could save him from death. At Gethsemane, God chose to tell him that his request had been denied and that he had to go to the cross. At the cross, he received no response to his heart-wrenching question. Yet, the author of Hebrews would have us view both these episodes as occasions when Jesus was heard. Now, this is important. What Hebrews wants us to realize is that being heard by God does not mean God will grant our request. Being heard does not imply that there is some kind of a concurrence between God's will and ours. And conversely, not being granted our petitions does not mean that they fell on deaf ears. Jesus was heard when he asked God to spare him from the cross. Jesus was heard when he declared his forsakenness. But in the first case, his request was rejected. In the second case, he received no response. But he was heard. The result is that even though God could save him from death, Jesus went to the cross and died there, while straining against the nails and ropes that cruelly pinned and bound him to the tree. We know that he was denied at Gethsemane. We know that he died at Calvary. How then could these two events in Jesus' life, so close to each other and with such grave consequences, ever comfort the listener? If we are thinking in this way, the author of Hebrews tells us, although he was a son, he learned obedience by the things that he suffered. And by being perfected in this way, he became the source of eternal salvation to all who obey him. It is easy for us to infer that this is talking about the resurrection, and we say that, along with the song, because he lives, I can face tomorrow. This is a common approach within Christian circles. We think of the resurrection as the occasion when we achieve the victory over death. But that is not how Hebrews presents the matter. According to Hebrews, we are not victorious in our resurrection. Remember, the one who could spare Jesus, save him from death, allowed him to go through to his death. So let me repeat, we are not victorious finally in our resurrection. Not what Hebrews says. There is actually no mention of the resurrection, even if we are reading it into it. We first read about Jesus crying out loud. Then we see that he was heard. And then we are told that he learned obedience through his sufferings. And we are told that this is how he was perfected, in and through his sufferings. And it is in and through his sufferings that he became a source of eternal salvation. I have said this many times before, and it bears saying again. Jesus' victory was not achieved on Easter, but on Good Friday. It is his death that is a victory over sin, Satan, and death. And Hebrews wants us to be very clear about what lies in store for those who are faithful to God. God is not going to spare his people from suffering. Any of you looking forward to that rapture, Forget about it. God is not going to spare his people from suffering. Rather, if Jesus' case is instructive, it is precisely through suffering that this God brings his people to a victorious life. This is a counterintuitive message and one that has been rejected by the church for the most part. The idea that God is perfecting his people through their sufferings and is granting them a victorious life in their sufferings is something that even after 20 centuries, the church has not accepted. When we face difficult times and go through periods of suffering and distress, we begin to think God has deserted us, or God is not in control, or maybe I've done something sinful. We think of what is happening to us as evil. Rarely, if ever, do we go down the path of saying that this suffering is somehow used by God for advancing his kingdom. Mind you, I am not advocating some sort of Christian masochism by which we seek out ways to bring sufferings on ourselves. Please dismiss that thought from your minds if you're thinking about that. And I do not wish for 1 minute to communicate the idea that God is inflicting us with the sufferings we are going through. You see, it was not God who sentenced Jesus to death. It was not God who drove the nails through his bruised, battered, and beaten body. It was the Jewish leaders who muscled Pilate to sentence Jesus, and it was Roman soldiers who pierced his body with the nails. But God brought good through that. So do not entertain the idea that I'm proposing that Christians are to be somehow people who get pleasure in pain, or who believe that God is the one who causes our sufferings. Get rid of those thoughts. Rather, God allows us to suffer because it is only when we suffer that we experience the same conditions under which Jesus was perfected and gained his victory. Please note very carefully what I am saying. Jesus was perfected through his sufferings, and it is only when we suffer that we experience the same conditions that Jesus faced. In other words, to think that God should not allow us to suffer is somehow to reject our calling to be like Jesus and to be perfected as he was. Jesus did not invite his sufferings. All he did was remain faithful to God. And that was what caused the world to lash out at him, his faithfulness to God. But when it did, he did not stop being faithful to God. Contrary to the common belief now that faithfulness to God results in a comfortable life, the Christian faith insists that faithfulness to God often results in discomfort and in many cases, suffering. Hebrews presents Jesus as the one who did not shy away from the sufferings that came to him as a consequence of his faithfulness to God. And the book declares that this is precisely why he is able to be a high priest for those who trust him. The Aaronic high priests were sinful like us. They were weak like us. They were unfaithful like us. But because Jesus was utterly faithful, the forces against him were greater. In other words, Jesus experienced opposition and suffering to a level that no one else could even imagine, precisely because he was utterly faithful. And because he has faced such a level of opposition and suffering, he knows how difficult it is to remain faithful. And it is because he knows from first-hand experience how difficult it is to be faithful that he is able to understand our struggles, empathize with us, and represent us as a high priest without condemning us. We are told that we can boldly approach the throne of grace because we know that the one who preceded us there is the one who has faced it all. He allowed evil to do its worst on him, and he emerged victorious by remaining faithful through his sufferings. Hebrews then says, on this topic, we have much to say, and it is difficult to explain since you have become sluggish in hearing. Let us be very clear what the book is saying. What preceded that statement, the major chunk of our passage, was just scratching the surface. Yeah, we have much more to say, he says, which means whatever has come before is just the surface. There's a tip of the iceberg. The idea that Jesus' victory and perfection came through his sufferings is the shallow things that the author of Hebrews was able at this point to tell his listeners. He wanted to tell them much more. The idea that our sufferings give us the occasion in which we learn from Jesus and approach our own perfection, that is just the tip of the iceberg. And that is what we have rejected. We have rejected even the tip. We don't even know what the iceberg is. And the reason why he could not go deeper was that the listeners had grown sluggish in hearing. Unfortunately, this is the case today too. How many of us are content with just being saved, treating Jesus' work like a get out of hell ticket? How many of us just want a comfortable life where we just, live and let live? How many of us want our faith to have the seal of respectability that society grants those who do not upset the apple cart? How many of us still think that suffering is something that is aberrant and abnormal in a Christian's life? This wondering why we suffer is a recent phenomenon. It is only after the church accepted the insidious Epicurean message of the Enlightenment, namely that the purpose of life is to live it up and avoid suffering, that we began to wonder why most of us go through periods of intense pain and suffering. But it wasn't much better before that. So let's not just fault the Epicureans, or the Enlightenment. The Constantinian synthesis of the early 4th century, which saw the Christian faith become the state religion, removed the threat of persecution from the church. Now, it was the church that had political power to wield over others. Now, prior to that, the church had gone through centuries of sporadic, but often widespread and devastating persecution under various Roman emperors, the worst being under Decius and very recently before that, Diocletian. The Christians were certainly worn out from such opposition and persecution. So it is no wonder that we accepted the compromise Constantine offered in the early 4th century. I do not fault those Christians. They were facing stuff that we cannot imagine. So when they accepted what Constantine gave them, a relief from the suffering and a recognition and an acceptance of the Christian religion, they accepted it. We would have done the same. But little did we realize that we had traded, as the Pink Floyd song Wish You Were Here declares, a walk-on part in the war for a lead role in a cage. You see, as soon as the church gained power, it lost its purpose. Instead of being salt of the earth, a light to the world, Christians began thinking of ways in which to convert other nations to the Christian faith. We began to think of terms that are abominable and detestable. The idea that there can be such a thing as a Christian nation, a lie perpetuated even today by many Christians who, having grown accustomed to the privileges that their power has given them, are afraid of losing ground to other visions of human purpose and destiny. Even after the Roman Empire collapsed, the states that formed after it in Europe and Asia followed suit by retaining Christianity as the official state-sponsored religion. Nation after nation adopted that insidious idea that there could be a Christian nation and that they were, to quote another document, a nation under God. By virtue of being supposedly Christian nations, there is no such thing. And since Christianity was now the official religion, Christians were no longer under threat from any political entity, and Christians began to see the world as a mosaic of nations that all needed then to be Christianized. But when we did that, we did not know what to do with passages such as the one we are dealing with today. So many passages in the New Testament declare that suffering is not something that we should crave. No one says that you should go out and try to, hey, make me suffer. But neither is it something that from which we should flee. And so Christians began adopting ridiculous practices like isolating themselves, going out in the desert, living on top of a pillar, even beating themselves up and inflicting harm on themselves. They were recognizing that something was missing from the Christian faith in this Constantinian synthesis in a world in which Christianity had morphed into Christendom. The New Testament is very clear that the followers of Jesus will face sufferings in this world, but these are not sufferings we invite on ourselves by refusing to engage in the world, going out in the desert, or anything like that, or inflicting harm on our bodies. Our bodies are the temple of the living God, and we violate his holy sanctuary if we harm ourselves. Our bodies are the means by which God has chosen to be present in this world. And so we must not harm ourselves or place ourselves in situations in which we are harmed for no reason. So, if suffering is a part of the Christian life, and if we are neither to seek nor flee from it, what purpose does it serve in our lives? It is clear that God allows his people to suffer. But why would God allow his people to suffer? What purpose does it serve? And how can the purpose of suffering ever be positive? Am I just perpetuating what Nietzsche called a slave religion, one in which we glorify suffering and begin to think of it as being good in its own rights, as many Christians did once they had to artificially create suffering for themselves? These are pertinent questions, and we will not be able to answer them, but we will be able to begin formulating an answer. It will not be easy sailing from now on, even if it was somewhat rocky even till now. Remember, we are trying to unravel what the author of Hebrews meant when he wrote, "On this topic, we have much to say, but it is difficult to explain since you have become sluggish in hearing." What was it he wanted his listeners to read and hear, but had to hold back from because they, like we, had reached a stage where they were unable and unwilling to learn more about suffering and its role in our lives? So, since it's going to become a little rocky, perhaps to provide a little brief insight, a short, heartwarming anecdote, maybe, I don't know. So, the story is told of a farmer who had some puppies he needed to sell. He painted a sign advertising the 4 pups and set about nailing it to a post at the edge of his yard. As he was driving the last nail into a post, he felt a tug on his overalls. He looked down into the eyes of a little boy. "Mister," said the boy, "I want to buy one of your puppies." "Well," said the farmer, as he rubbed the sweat off the back of his neck, "these puppies come from fine parents and cost a good deal of money." The boy dropped his head for a moment. Then, reaching deep into his pocket, he pulled out a handful of change, held it up to the farmer. "I've got 39 cents. Is that enough to take a look?" "Sure," said the farmer. And with that, he let out a whistle. "Here, Dolly," he called. And out from the doghouse and down the ramp ran Dolly, followed by 4 little balls of fur. The little boy pressed his face against the chain link fence, his eyes dancing with delight. As the dogs made their way to the fence, the boy noticed something else stirring inside the doghouse. Slowly, another little ball appeared, this one noticeably smaller. Down the ramp it slid. Then, in a somewhat awkward manner, the little pup began hobbling towards the others, doing its best to catch him. "I want that one," the little boy said, pointing to the runt. The farmer knelt down at the boy's side and said, "Son, you don't want that puppy. He will never be able to run and play with you like these other dogs." With that, the little boy stepped back from the fence, reached down, began rolling up one leg of his trousers, revealing a steel brace running down both sides of his leg, attaching itself to a specially made shoe. Looking back at the farmer, he said, "You see, sir, I don't run too well myself. He will need someone who understands." And what Hebrews tells us that we needed and still need someone who truly understands. We needed and still need someone who has stepped into our shoes and knows how to win in them.
Tell Gian to come down.
In his book, Out of Solitude, Andre Nouwen wrote, when we honestly ask ourselves which persons in our lives mean the most to us, we often find that it is those who, instead of giving advice, solutions, or cures, have chosen rather to share our pain and touch our wounds with a warm and tender hand. The friend who can be silent with us in a moment of despair or confusion, who can stay with us in our hour of grief and bereavement, who can tolerate not knowing, not curing, not healing, and face with us the reality of our powerlessness. That is a friend who cares. and the deeper knowledge that Hebrews wanted to tell his listeners but couldn't because they were dull of hearing is what we are going to explore now. Our passage claims that Jesus was perfected through his sufferings. It also claims that it is because he was perfected through his sufferings that he is able to empathize with weak humans like us who are prone to giving in to our weaknesses. It also claims that Jesus' prayers, which did not spare him from death, nonetheless entailed God hearing his prayers. So what does that mean for us? You'll all ask for application. Today, you all will wish I didn't go there. Unfortunately, we are kept like children by some of our well-meaning preachers and songwriters. How many of us have heard something to the effect, Jesus paid a debt that he did not owe because I owed a debt I could not pay? Or as the Newsboys song goes, Jesus paid it all to him I owe. Sin had left a crimson stain. He washed it white as snow. Even the old hymns, the one we sang today, O Lord our God, are the same. Can you even think of a single hymn in which, apart from a passing line or reference, we welcome sufferings as part of the Christian life? I cannot. I invite you to please prove me wrong. Maybe I forgot. Please prove me wrong. But what about our preachers? Just listen to any of our big-time preachers today. John Piper, John MacArthur, Francis Chan, Chuck Swindoll, Paul Washer, Alistair Begg, Rick Warren come to mind. These are not those I follow, so let's ignore them. Maybe you follow them. What about the ones I do follow? Like John Polkinghorne, Alistair McGrath, John Walton, Paula Gooder, Sandra Richter, and N.T. Wright. Listen to them, and they will wrestle with suffering in a manner that we would be hard-pressed to find anywhere in the New Testament. Listen to what these giants of Christianity say about why we suffer, and you will see that something is grossly missing. And this is precisely why the author of Hebrews could not go further and had to stop his discussion on the sufferings of Jesus with the words, on this topic we have much to say, and it is difficult to explain since you have become sluggish in hearing. The sad thing is that our leaders proclaim half the gospel as the full gospel. And because the other half is not proclaimed, many of us are unprepared to face what life throws at us. Hebrews has devoted quite a bit of space to telling us that Jesus learned obedience through his sufferings, and that Jesus achieved perfection through his sufferings, and that he is able to empathize with us who are weak because of his sufferings. And then Hebrews tells us that we are not in a position to hear anymore because we are quite happy with whatever we heard in that first instance. Our ears have become dull and unreceptive to any further understanding because we think we have heard the full message. What the half gospel answers is the question, how are sinful humans saved? But the half gospel does not answer the question, to what end are sinful humans saved? You see, all the presentations of the gospel stop at what God has done for me to be saved. Why has God saved me? Why did he even bother? What did Jesus hope would happen in me after I began trusting him? This is missing in the gospel message today. And because it is missing, that crucial element that Hebrews wanted us to understand is lost. And as a result, we do not know how to make sense of what happens to us when we suffer. You see, Jesus is able to empathize with sinful humans because he suffered. There was no ivory tower thought experiment that Jesus did in order to reach a position where he could understand our frailty and empathize with us in our struggles. But today, he is not physically present on earth, but he is present in and through his church throughout the world. And if his church fails to demonstrate his ability to empathize with humans in their weakness, then the witness of Jesus and the church is weakened and destroyed. But if Jesus learned to empathize only through his sufferings, and if Jesus can demonstrate his empathy to weak humans only through his empathetic messengers in the church, then it follows that Jesus can only demonstrate his empathy to weak humans if his church learns to empathize through its sufferings. In other words, We have been proclaiming half the gospel because the other half involves our recognizing that it is only by our sufferings that we can truly empathize with other weak humans around us. So shame on us when we have tried to make life easier for ourselves, either through protests, peaceful or violent, or through litigation. Every move that the church makes to spare itself from difficulties that come from following Jesus is a move to silence the second half of the gospel. You see, the good news is not just that God saved me, it is that he also has a purpose for me, that of becoming more like Jesus. And I cannot become like Jesus without also embracing the aspects of this life that resulted in his being perfected. Let us think about this clearly. Since the Olympics are going on, they're going to end today. Yeah. So let us consider an example from the realm of sports. On the 1st of this month, Lamont Marcel Jacobs from Italy shocked the world by winning the men's 100-meter sprint. He trains for about 6 hours daily. So do all the others who competed with 6 hours daily training. If an athlete like him, person who has won the Olympic gold medal, needs to train so much in order to stay at the top of his game, what would you say about someone who is happy training for an hour a day, or an hour a week, or 3 hours a year? You know what I mean. You would surely say, there is no way this person would ever qualify for an international 100-meter sprint event. No way at all. If Jesus himself needed to suffer in order to become perfect, what would you say about a Christian who says, Jesus paid it all, I don't need to go through any suffering? Or what would you say about a Christian who complains to other people when he or she is going through a difficult time? Who do we think we are if we think we can become mature Christians without going through the same kind of ordeals that made Jesus into the person he was and is? What kind of entrenched pride is this that thinks we can do something that even Jesus could not? But you see, our big-time preachers do not want us to hear this. No one will hang around a morose preacher like me who tells them that they need to suffer in order to become like Jesus. No, please, they'll say, I'll do my daily devotions, attend church on Sunday. I'll even attend a midweek Wednesday session. And to show you that I really suffer, I will attend your Friday Bible study, Deepak. But actual suffering? No, please. That's certainly not what my sugar daddy Jesus wants for me. No, he has wonderful plans for me, a safe and comfortable life at least, if not what I really want, a beachfront in southern France. We fool ourselves by saying what we want to be, that we want to be like Jesus, when we do not want to have anything to do with the things that made him who he was and is. And our big-time preachers allow this by comforting us with vain platitudes that, if we but just spare a moment to think, would disintegrate in shambles. If the only way to become a world-class athlete is to train like a world-class athlete, then the only way to become like Jesus is to have a similar regimen as Jesus did. And according to Hebrews, he learned obedience through the things he suffered, and he was perfected through the things he suffered. Jesus has not called us to bask in the glory of our salvation. He has called us to become like him. He has called us to call others, and we can effectively call others only if we are able to perceptively empathize with others. And we can only perceptively empathize with others if we suffer like them. The more we suffer, the more nuanced our understanding of human frailty will become, and the more perceptive we will be to the varieties of sufferings that our neighbors experience. This is the only way to become like Jesus. All your Bible studies, all your devotionals, all your praise and worship is not going to do it. Some of you may be thinking this is an addition to the gospel. It is indeed an addition to that truncated gospel we often hear, and that is most often proclaimed by our big-time preachers. But this is the gospel. I am saved to become like Jesus, and I cannot become like Jesus unless I train like Jesus. But if you still think I have added something, you are free to think that. But don't deceive yourself into thinking you will ever become like Jesus. If you reject the means by which he became who he was and is, don't deceive yourself. It's not happening. No matter what those big time preachers say, no matter how many people say, if you reject the means by which Jesus became who he is and was, there is no way you are going to become like him. You see, Jesus wants his church to be filled with people who, like him, are able to empathize with others in their pain and grief and to lift them to the dignity that is theirs by virtue of their being created in God's image. The forgiveness that we have received because Jesus empathized with us is to be the fuel for our being willing to empathize with others. But there is only one way of doing that. If Jesus was perfected through his sufferings, so must we. That is the only way of following Jesus, the only way of becoming perceptive empathizers. Amen.